Great. So welcome to the Global Street Fight, everybody. Thank you. Just a housekeeping item. For those of you who might have wandered in here thinking that you're going to see a pay-per-view showing of the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, you're a couple of months too early, okay? But if you're here to help out, to get some help on your NCAA tournament picks, you're just in time. We have an amazing panel coming up next. They've got a way with numbers, and I think they might be really helpful to those of you who are looking for your March Madness brackets, some help on that, okay? But before I bring the panel up, just wanted to kind of offer up a couple of things to consider about the session that we'll be having in a few minutes, which is the digital storytelling and the way to engage audiences when speed and accuracy are still the primary goals for newsrooms. And so two things. One, I think we realize there's a lot of content and data being created at this point. And I think I saw an estimate in 2013. Researchers actually said that we had reached 4 zettabytes of data that year. What does that mean, okay? That is the equivalent of the entire US population shooting a digital photo every second of every day from now until July. And that's not even Kim Kardashian. So that's a lot of data. Second thing, there is more information now that the government is making available through open data, which is data that is readable or can be processed through computers, okay? And so as you consider those two thoughts, let me just move this along. Those are among two of the reasons you actually heard last month the White House announced the appointment of the nation's first ever chief digital strategist, a scientist. That's Dr. DJ Patil. And his challenge is the same as the newsrooms today. He wants to help us all be able to extract knowledge and insights from these data sets that are now made available. And that's exactly what the newsrooms are doing. And so our next panel will be talking about that, how to really create those narratives around this, the numbers. And we're really excited. And apparently Dr. Patil is as well. He's very excited, if you don't know it. This Saturday is Pi Day for all you geeks out there. So with that, let me call up my panel here. And if you would join me, we have Rob Barry, Eric Chemi, and Rahul Chopra. Let's move this over. Perfect. Got the mics right up there. So to my left, we've got Rob Barry, who is an investigative reporter, and he's co-chief of data journalism at the Wall Street Journal. Great to have you here.
Hello.
Eric just made it, right, just in time. Eric Chemi is the senior editor-at-large at data journalism at CNBC. Great to have you here. And Rahul Chopra, just in. I know you've been flying around a lot, so great to have you here as well. CEO of Storyful. Some great stories coming out of there. So let me get started first with Rob. I guess the main question is, what is the approach to data journalism at the Wall Street Journal, and how is that team structured within the newsroom?
Sure. So obviously, I'd say in the past 5 years, newspapers, it really goes back much further than that, but the real concentrated effort to focus on data journalism, figure out how to parlay data into stories, has really taken off in the past 5 years. And the Journal, along with the Times and every other media organization pretty much that I can think of, has tried to figure out ways to capture that. At the Journal, we currently have a team in the investigative unit, which is where I work, of 3 people who do this work. And then scattered across the company are a number of other people who obviously have skills with respect to data.
Okay. That's a breathtaking amount of teamwork going on behind the scenes. And there's a lot of work that's going on for the stories that you've done recently. I know you've broken some really important articles. In fact, tell us who the plate lickers are. Got to put this up. There you go. Yeah. And why you did a story about them.
Well, so we've been doing a series of stories on stockbrokers. There's about 630,000 of them in the United States. And the industry is regulated by an outfit called FINRA, which is a non-governmental entity. It's responsible for tracking all of the issues involving registration. So anyone who's basically able to trade on stock exchanges has to get licensed from FINRA. And we've been doing a series of stories kind of trying to pick apart these license records. The thing is that because they're non-governmental, you spoke about how government provides lots of data. Obviously, freedom of information law means that, in theory at least, news organizations can get access to information that government holds. However, when it's non-governmental, as is the case here, you can't. So we've been sort of going about this in this process of getting information from every single state in the country. And one of the stories we did, which talked about plate liquors, which are events like this one, but more in like places like South Florida, where generally 3 p.m. rolls around and it's like dinner time, and a bunch of old folks come and they gather around in an investment seminar, and they get pitched. So we had there's long been industry lore that scenario was happening, particularly in places like South Florida. So we took the data and did analysis that's sort of comparable to what you'd have in epidemiology and criminology, and identified that there were, in fact, these locations across the country where you had these clusters of stockbrokers who had particularly troubled disciplinary records. And I think there were 16 clusters we found. 13 of them were right there alongside wealthy, elderly people. So we were able to empirically show, hey, this actually is happening.
Now, I know this is the kind of content that the folks who are watching the traffic on the site love.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm on the editorial side of the newsroom. I try and forgive me because I know you guys probably disagree. I try and stay as far away from the business side as I can. So I mean, I don't oftentimes know what gets traffic and what doesn't. But yes, these stories generally, when we do kind of high-profile investigative projects, we had a series of stories using Medicare data over the past couple of years, actually. And each one of these things, the journal, because of the resources that go into it, the journal devotes a lot of energy to promoting, and they get a significant amount of reaction usually.
Terrific. I definitely want to come back to that. Just want to have you give an explanation as to how things work at the Wall Street Journal. But wanted to move on to Eric. So at CNBC, the sort of data-driven market news is the bread and butter, right, for CNBC.
Right.
Now, how has data journalism changed that in your reporting?
I think because CNBC started off so markets focused, obviously you can watch it on TV, during the day they follow the stock market all day long. If you include the web component and then what they're trying to do on television, they want to add a little bit of an extra layer, because it's not about telling you just what the numbers are anymore, because we can get that on our phones. And so they know that, and they know that in order for people to watch, you need to get a little bit more value out of it. What do these numbers mean? What does it mean about business? So a lot of the data journalism, quote, data journalism that we're trying to do over there isn't necessarily just the pure numbers, isn't not just here's where prices are going or here's where the economy is going, because everyone has that information. So what can we tell about businesses? Where does data that maybe nobody else has? So obviously, in the same manner that when they do their TV interviews, you always see the big exclusive line at the bottom. They like to pitch their exclusive. They want to do the same thing with data. What is the data that we have that nobody else has? Maybe because in the same way we can book a CEO, we can book, for example, the data from that company that they might give us that they might not give anyone else. So that's one of the approaches that we happen to be taking over there, because we can't really compete with the journal in a lot of the things that they do, so we have to compete in a slightly different way.
I think that's the interesting part as well. Now, I've been watching the stories you've been reporting on, and we're enjoying some great weather now, but about a month ago you did a great story about the blizzard, right? I've got an image for that. And apparently what everybody ordered online during the blizzard. Tell us about how this story came about.
So this is a relationship we developed with the people at Grubhub, Seamless, and obviously, as you know, New York City, if you use Seamless, they have everybody's order. And so we figured there might be something interesting there. You could use it in New York City. You can use the data across the country with their Grubhub brand. And we were just curious, well, do people order different food during the blizzard? What does it mean for the food industry? What does it mean for, do people get tipped more? I mean, are there certain things that do better weather-wise? Because we always hear about the economy does worse in the weather, but what can do better in this situation? And can we measure the exact food items? And part of it's fun, part of it is to try to get some web traffic, part of it is to have an interesting story or something that helps you go on television and have an interesting take with, let's say, a restaurant CEO, for example. So it's a way to hit a lot of different factors all at once through one story.
So give us some highlights here. We know carbs are important during a blizzard.
So, yeah, mostly it was cheese pizzas. Pepperoni pizzas were also in the top 15. Meatball subs. So a lot of Italian food. There were certain things that, and just because this is what I would order, so I remembered it as well. But mostly a lot of carbs, and there were certain things that would fall off. They didn't want to give us specific, restaurant data because that might be a little bit too touchy with their clients. So being able to aggregate larger data sets was the key, but mostly cheese pizzas and pepperoni pizzas and garlic knots. And it was because I think people think that you can get pizza quicker. So you saw deliveries from places that would turn things around faster. But anyway, so it just helped lead to a conversation for if you're a New York City business, what does that mean if you're trying to switch up your game plan for a blizzard versus regular weather?
Yeah, you got to check this out if you haven't yet. So we definitely want to get back to you. And I think in our audience, we've got many media relations folks. Definitely going to have questions for you in a little bit, how you work with Grubhub in that case. Just really quickly, moving on to Rahul. Now, we're hearing here on how data science is changing the way newsrooms are gathering and reporting the news. And what's really interesting about Storyful is the way technology is changing content tracking. Now, 15 years back, I think most newsrooms were actually using technology mainly to detect their own content to make sure that, for instance, there wasn't any piracy going on with non-licensed users. I know that was a big deal for newsroom agencies at that point. So you fast forward 15 years later now, and they're interested in all that content. So not just their own, but all the professional, independent journalists out there, citizen journalists. Tell us a little bit about Storyful and how it's providing value.
Sure. So I'll give a 2-second background on what Storyful is. Storyful is a company that News Corp acquired at the end of 2013. I'm also the global head of video for News Corp, so I led the acquisition for the business. What it got me excited about Storyful is it really is in the business of, to simplify this, discovering, verifying, and acquiring the rights to the very best of what social content is and has to offer. And that is the most timely, the most engaging, the most relevant content that could be coming from any social platform. So basically the way that we work is we have access to basically the fire hose for every major social platform that you can imagine around the globe. What we've done is built technology that sits on top of that is basically there to identify when clusters of people are beginning to talk about a topic or a keyword or a hashtag or an event that may be relevant for one of our partners. And our partners include the likes of the Journal, and I think we work with over 150 different news organizations, brands, marketers, agencies today. Actually, I know that. I should know that. I'm the CEO of the company. The focus of the technology is, or the piece that we've added on top of that, and this is where we're different than most companies out there, is we've built a newsroom that sits on top of that, right? So a newsroom that's basically sitting at the nexus of where data can help us identify the most relevant and timely of content for a partner. And whether that is a photo or a video or a tweet or an article, it doesn't matter to us. We dig in, discover if it's authentic, if it's real, if it's valuable to our partner, and then as quickly and as efficient as possible, deliver it to them to use.
Now, you have some pretty interesting examples here. I just grabbed this one. Tell us about this particular application, just exposing some of the hoaxes that are out there. I think we're all pretty familiar with some of the most recent viral stories. Can you give us just an example of how this works?
Sure. It's almost it's basically weekly now. We're debunking some stories that are stemming from social in a way that where a lot of news organizations were either trusting, taking, and using. Basically, the way that we work in some ways is we're an extension of a newsroom, right? We're in the business of helping to debunk, demyth, verify, and acquire the rights to content. And in a lot of cases, those are events like viral hoaxes that news organizations just don't know if they can trust. To the point where I think we have basically a relationship with the Jimmy Kimmel Show because of the stuff that they put out.
Remember that? Okay.
And every day they're thinking. I mean, I remember there was a story going around in Ukraine about this gold throne that was in one of the palaces or something, or houses that were found, and news organizations ran with it right away, and that picture was probably 4 or 5 years old. Things like that every single day. We have an incredible group of journalists that are basically data-driven, social-first, investigative journalists, and they're pretty impressive to watch.
It is, and you're just seeing some of the challenges that reporters, journalists, newsroom operations are facing today, just in these three examples. Now, going back to Rob, I know you travel around a lot educating journalists and newsrooms about what you're doing. What are some of the biggest challenges they're telling you they're facing?
Well, I mean, we just heard about how maybe they've turned the corner. I mean, in terms of where I come from, I worked at the Miami Herald before I worked at the Journal. I'm familiar with local newspapers. I don't think that there's a lot of good news at this point out of the places that I'm aware of. That said, I was just at a conference last week of this sort where we, a bunch of tech journalists, when I say tech journalists, I guess I mean more like investigative and data-driven journalists with technical skills gathered together. It's sponsored by a wonderful organization called Investigative Reporters and Editors. And this conference, which was in Atlanta this year, had like record attendance. It was like close to 1,000 reporters and people there. And one of the things which I think is driving the, just anecdotally appears to be really critical, and where you see the growth is obviously in kind of the news application process. So people who are building tools and applications that allow users and readers to dive into data, and you have visualizations and all that kind of thing. It's where this big growth has come. So just this conference that I was at, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, probably had a third of the number of people at it. But the people who are there now are the people doing that.
And you're teaching them basics, because I think you and I talked. One of the slideshows that I came across in researching panelists here was Rob's, and he had to show, I guess, the difference between median and mean. Yeah,
I mean, most people do not get into journalism because they have like math degrees, So there's this weird intersection now where news organizations are sort of drifting into this almost social science role, or at least that's where they're feeling they should move, especially when you're dealing with high-profile type of work. But journalists are typically, the way that a journalist does a story is like 3 anecdotes, and there's your trend, and that's the old saying. And I think that a lot of people in the business want to learn more about how to do technical things. They want to learn more about how to use basic statistics, and that particular panel which you saw, we went through, it was me and a reporter from the Washington Post. We went through everything from the difference between median and mean up to kind of, in journalism terms, kind of advanced statistics, and huge appetite for that.
That's great. So just switching again to Eric, now you're probably more pitchable in terms of, the differences here. Can you give us some best practice examples of how you've worked with, let's say, a brand communicator or a media relations person?
Yes, I guess our version of data journalism is a little bit less, maybe the longer investigations, for example, and it's because it's more of a market-driven focus. So we're trying to get stuff out more on a daily basis, some quick turns. So there are some pitches that are worthwhile to us if people can bring us something that is exclusive, that's data that nobody else has. Sometimes people will pitch up stories that are, oh, here's our press release, can you cover it? Well, that's not really something that we would do, or we have some stuff and it's coming out tomorrow, but I think they don't realize that it takes a long time to actually go through the numbers and figure out where the story is, or where they think the story is not maybe where we think the story is. So, but there are, like, in the case of Seamless, I think they probably had pitched something several months ago that we didn't necessarily use, but we built a relationship to then figure out, well, where might be a good story, so we were able to do the Blizzard one, for example. So in that sense, I think coming up with exclusive data, coming up with data that you wouldn't necessarily want to give away. I think some companies feel like, oh, all our data needs to be private and we don't want to give it away. But a lot of the times, nobody really cares, in the sense that you're not going to reveal something too secret about your firm that the data is hiding, but it might actually have a good story for people to understand that, oh, your company's really smart and they have this information and it doesn't give away anything competitive. I think sometimes the best stories are not even about the companies themselves, but about the data that the companies provide. So I think the companies end up looking off better if we're not even writing about the company, but just, we're not writing about Seamless here. We're writing about the blizzard. We're writing about people's behavior. So most of the things that are interesting are how do people behave? Because I think people want to read, well, do I fall in the average category? Am I an aberration? What does my neighbor do? What does my coworker do? So a lot of this behavioral psychology and as it might affect markets, tradings, or economics and business, that where I think we find a good niche for some of our stories.
Yeah, I think that part is really familiar to those of us who are on the communication side and the brand side, because we've certainly been using polls and surveys to do exactly that, which is to try to predict behavior, right? And so this is just a great way possibly of working now with the newsroom and a journalist to do that, to bring a story to life in that way. Now, that's also an interesting point on the content side for Rahul. So you've primarily worked with newsrooms. So what is the application for the brand communicators of this particular platform?
Sure. I think brands are in a similar position or trending towards a similar position where newsrooms are. We're in the business of communicating with our consumer base. I'll give you an example. Coca-Cola has 97 million likes on Facebook. Now that is an avenue to go directly to consumers to put out a message about what they want those consumers to know about. And that could be them creating content. I think Coca-Cola has a magazine called Journeys today. But how do you create content at the speed of news that is valuable, that is engaging, authentic and valuable for your audience? And the way that we work with brands to do that is in the same way we work with news organizations. It's a social radar. We point the radar at an area of focus that a brand is interested in, discover the most valuable of content from the social web for them to use, acquire the rights and put it in their hands in a timely fashion that could be used either in its outright as a piece of just content or as part of a larger package. And clearing all the rights, potentially getting you in touch with the content creator, doing all that legwork, basically creating a social newsroom in a box for a brand is the service. But we were looking at some of the key reasons that we work with newsrooms today. It's can we find you content that you can have comfort and confidence in using? Is it authentic, or is it the original content creator that you're getting me in touch with? Is this on brief in regards to a story I'm looking to tell? Well, those are the same attributes that brands are looking for today. Can we be in the business of providing insights, intelligence, and content to a brand in the same way we do for the New York Times? That's been a focus for us for about the last 7 months, and so far so good.
Great. Well, I know we've got a ton of questions from the audience, so I'll open it up now and get a conversation going. Any questions? Got a few. Right. Right. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Mike Samek. I'm Director of Digital Strategy with G&S. I had a question about privacy and versus balance against the right to know. In particular, as the public is learning about how their behavior is becoming exposed through data, how are you balancing that whole aspect?
Is that for me?
Sure, please.
I think in the cases where we've done stories, let's say with companies that provide us data, it's always been anonymized and aggregated, and it's nothing that would identify any individual person. And it seems to me that even the things that we see are so small compared to the data the company already has and the company already knows about people. So for example, like Uber knows where every journalist is driving around and may use it against them, but they would never give that to the public, I don't think. But I don't know, it is a tricky question, but I feel like a lot of that data ends up going to credit card companies and they use it to market things in the mail or in your email address. So I don't know if it's the storytelling side of it that's so much problematic, is just that the data is already out there and it's being shared behind the scenes. At least in the stuff that you might see in the newspaper, on television, or online, you can see what it is, and it's nothing that actually highlights or identifies anyone individually, but all the things that do identify people individually, you would never even see because it's all behind the scenes anyway.
I want to just add one thing to that. It's a fascinating thing that's going on right now generally. It's a great question. And I mean, we work with lots of data which has it's very confidential. We have agreements with like CMS, the agency that manages Medicare. They provide us with a huge swath of Medicare data, which has, you know, I believe they've taken names out, but there's enough information in there that if we wanted to, we could track down who it is. We've obviously all signed legal agreements. Anyone who can access that information saying we will not do that. We have to store this stuff in a locked room, you know, and all sorts of security procedures have to be in place. That's a common problem. And it's actually one other just issue that I don't know if you guys care about, but the right to know issues with respect to federal government data, especially, you know, there's all sorts of privacy laws that restrict the media's access to you know, federal data, basically. And in some cases, you know, there's almost as if the privacy implications are being used to sort of lock the data down. But of course, then there's also many times when, you know, you can understand why people wouldn't want that out there, but it's still a product of the government. So, you know, when it comes to private companies, you know, we can point them to the fact that we have, you know, these agreements with like CMS and say we are, you know, we have checks and balances in place. We know how to deal with identifiable information if that's what you want to give us.
Thank you. More questions? Oh, right here.
Hi, I'm Natalie Fine with SAP. I do corporate reputation work for them, and I want to bridge back to something that Etienne focused on, which is stories that come from emerging and growing markets. You know, it's great to know what happened during the blizzard and how many people wanted pizza or the plate liquors in the United States, but I'm just curious what your observations or sense of how much these data-driven stories are of interest regarding data that comes from outside of the United States, both in terms of where the stories may be, but do readers respond to data-driven stories outside of the United States?
There's huge interest, and yes, and there's lots of data. You know, in the U.S., a lot of data has been kind of beaten to death in a lot of respects. I mean, we've been doing this for a while. There's areas in Asia, Hong Kong, where financial data is still kind of being systematized in such a way that analysis can even be done. You know, I did a story on the Russian election of 2011, and you know, and you know, when Putin first began his most recent push to gain power, and you know, we looked at voting irregularities, and it had a huge reaction in Russia, and you know, I absolutely feel like we need to be the U.S. media needs to be looking for more stories abroad. I mean, there's just so much, I mean, so many areas of interest that have not yet been well tapped, and there's like an outfit called Coding for Africa, you know, and they're trying to figure out ways to develop structured data that can be used by journalists in the U.S. to do stories on Africa. So lots of interest.
And Rahul, I think you're seeing that in the content you're tracking.
Yeah, from our perspective, we actually are, the social platforms you typically expect us to be looking across: Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, YouTube. But we also look at vContact in Russia, Weibo, Youku in China. We just signed a deal with Youku actually yesterday. So we're actually scouring the globe when it comes to social content that may be valuable to our partners. And every day, more and more are asking about those stories and unique events that are happening globally as opposed to just in the US. It's a major focus for us in our business.
Yeah, I think I would say my answer is closer to Rob's answer. I think partly just because our audience is mostly domestic, so the interest tends to be more domestic stories. And also, I think talking about data itself, everyone here knows that when you look at a set of numbers, the people who know that space better know what those numbers really mean, and an outsider can look at the same numbers and not really understand, oh, well, you have to take this into account, or this year a rule changed, so that's why these numbers went up or down. And so if you don't really know the information, then just looking at numbers can lead you to wrong conclusions. So I think when it comes to those emerging markets, it's important to actually work with someone who's local. Like if you and I are looking at data that comes from an emerging market, but we don't live there, so we don't necessarily know, well, what does that mean? Is there some historical context or something politically that is happening that maybe those numbers are incorrect or wrong, but if we just reported on them straight without having someone on the grounds there, we could get into trouble. So I think it's just one step harder because it's not domestic data that we're more familiar with.
Yeah.
So what all of you guys are doing is really fascinating, and I have a million questions, but the first one, I guess, for Rahul would be, essentially, it sounds like part of Storyful's business model has been to create a business out of fact-checking. Shouldn't that be a part of what every news organization is doing? And how do you protect your business in the future against, growing fact-checking, I guess, within existing news organizations as the veracity of social stories becomes more called into question?
Yeah, it's a great question. What we talk about is we're in the business of powering great storytelling. What we're trying to do is, in some ways, the dirty work, the grunt work, to basically get in the hands of people like these guys content that they could use to do what they do best, which is tell great stories. The verification work, the reaching out to content creators, giving context and insights from social, that's stuff that we basically created a human algorithm, if you will, that is somewhat proprietary, somewhat IP-based, but we're just better and faster than others that are out there. But it shouldn't be something that a journalist should have to, in today's world, especially with journalists, especially with guys like these, being asked to do more today than they've ever had to do in the past, also have to worry about. That's how we look at the business. We're not competing with a newsroom, we're an extension of your newsroom. It comes back to, we're a B2B play that is in the background. So if these guys can tell great stories on the strength of content that we can find for them, we're happy, they're happy, everybody wins.
So my question is for Rob, but I'd love anybody to jump in and answer. So you've done some unbelievable pieces over the last couple of years and greatly appreciated it. Sort of reinvigorated my desire to really search out the journal every day. Since your stories are very much data-driven and you get that piece out, where and when can you tell that there's more to come? When do you sort of become a little bit of, Woodward and Bernstein and say, I've got to run this until it's fixed, versus my responsibility is just to let the public know that this is going on?
It's an interesting question. I think we do, the unit that I work on generally always wants to have stories where there's more to come. My editor really discourages one-offs. He's not interested in, if it's a great story, obviously we want to do it, but I mean, we're looking for thematic arcs. We're looking for things that will last years. I mean, the Medicare stuff is probably the pinnacle of what we're looking for, which has been going on since 2009. We've been doing coverage on that before I even got there. Once we've covered something, like even if we don't have any ideas for the future, we're always looking for those and definitely want to maximize the scope of what we do.
About the conclusion piece, do you feel obligated to want it resolved, or is it just a matter of your role is really just to tell the story?
So the solutions, if you will, I mean, that's something that usually most investigative units, when they're are going to put out a story at some point along the way that kind of tries to wrap up what's been looked at, and looking forward, here's some legislation that might, or whatever, and that's usually called for. Yes, we usually are expected to produce something like that.
Questions? Just going back to, do you have one? Okay. Go.
Probably a quick one. I'm Susan Fitzpatrick, Director of Communications at Ally Financial. I'm curious to understand how you prefer data to be packaged, because a lot of times we have data that we think is an interesting story, and it's nice to provide a couple bullet points or percentages to tell our story. A lot of times we get the question back, well, can we just have all your raw data? So I'm just wondering, how do you handle those pitches? What's the preference and what's the balance?
Yeah, I guess normally I would say the same thing. The raw data is good, because sometimes I feel like people are spinning me a story that...
Never.
Yeah, that's never happened to me. That's why I get the raw data. And, but it's just good to see it, because sometimes I don't actually know, because somebody will say, like, oh, this was the average. And I think, well, is that the mean or median? That's the first question. And then they say, oh, I don't know. So then I say, well, then you better just send me all the raw data and I'll figure it out myself. And then I might find other things, or I might have questions. So generally the raw data is good, or at least some of the raw data, just to see what it looks like. But a couple of bullet points isn't enough for me to tell a story. And if I have to then go on television and talk about it, it's definitely not enough for me, because I don't really have enough context to go and say, oh, well, these are the 2 data points I know. That's the end of my segment. So I need more in order to tell the story and figure it out and ask a bunch of questions. The bullet points are good as a starting point, but I can't do anything, or I can't do enough with it, and then in the end the story's not going to be that good, and it might even make it look like your company doesn't really have a good handle on the data because it's just so skeleton.
And to that point, I mean, our credibility kind of lives and dies on every single story that we do. And so when we're doing something with data, if we analyze it, if we present information that's wrong, or that was sort of a misinterpretation or a misunderstanding, that blows back right on us. I mean, we're the ones that did that, even if it's so if we use someone else's analysis, and yet we know that there's underlying information that we could have looked at, we'd be kind of not doing our jobs to have not looked at that.
That made me think of a question for both Eric and Rahul. So Eric, just going back to your response here, many of your stories are cross-platform, so you're not just doing something for the online site. So how do you actually, what are the mechanics of putting together that story? You're searching for video, and sometimes you're doing the stand-up yourself. Sometimes you're sitting at a panel discussion like this on air. How does that kind of work out for you?
It allows for different types of stories to be told. So some things are just great web-only pieces because there's a lot of information there and people need to sit through and just work with it. Some of it can be discussed on television because you have something that's really interesting and it's talkable and it leads to other questions. Other parts, they require a video. So the good thing is we have a lot of avenues to do things. Just like I'm sure you know at the Journal, there's things that should go in the newspaper, there's things that should go online, maybe different parts of it. There's some Venn diagram that combines the two on the 2 platforms. So our equivalent is online and television, or video as well. So it allows for some flexibility. So maybe in the case like that, the raw data would be good for the website. The summary points would be good for the television article or the television story, but then we can lead people back to the website to read the rest of it. So we can use different slices of it in different places.
And so for Storyful, similarly, I mean, lots of newsrooms are coming to you for content. Now, I recall that you also helped Facebook set up its newswire. So talk a little bit more about that and how you're helping newsrooms create all of these assets, right, to piece the story together.
Yeah, so Facebook, the example of Facebook was we structured a deal where Facebook was in a position, Facebook, there's so much content that is news related that is valuable that starts from the Facebook platform. But really, most journalists think of Twitter first when it comes to finding content. So we basically built their newsroom where we have access to the fire hose, and we're scouring Facebook for content that's relevant for news organizations on Facebook and getting it in the hands of journalists. And then we replicated that for the technology vertical, and then you can expect others to come after that. And we've done that now for Google. For every major election, you'll find election hubs. I think we're in the process of setting one up for the UK. Obviously, there's a lot will happen with the US. How again, can we discover, verify, and get the very best of that content in front of, in that case, journalists as well as consumers. And again, it could be any type of content. It's just what is it that people want to know more about, and can we bring context to that story that then could be spun into something else, or is just valuable on its own?
Yeah, it's about finding that narrative in the numbers and the assets and bringing that together. Just to play devil's advocate, what would you say to those maybe who are concerned that the numbers are driving the narrative too much?
Can I just go back really quickly to that
please.
question about the raw data?
Oh, go ahead. You thought of something else. Okay.
So the raw data is good, not because we want to actually publish it all, because no one actually wants to read it, because it's really boring. I get raw data, and I don't actually know what's going on half the time. It's just meant to figure out where did the summary come from, because at the end, the story mostly just has the summary. Like in the thing where you showed where the brokers tend to cluster, that was just a map with 16 cities on it. There wasn't actually thousands of lines of data, but he probably needed to go through thousands of lines of data and maybe he's the only person that saw it. So maybe there's things that only I see just so I can tell the story. So that's really what I wanted to say. Is not we want the data to publish it because we don't want to give away your info. We just need to figure it out, which I think then goes to the numbers-driven story. It's just something to help me figure out what's going on, because then I still need to call and get a quote, or I still need to find someone who's on the ground. Hey, is this really true? Do you experience this? So for example, I guess, all right, I'll tell you. The story's not out yet, but this is a good one for next week.
We won't tell.
So the day after St. Patrick's Day, emergency visits to the dentist go up 64% across the country because people get their teeth knocked out. And so we can rank by state which states have the biggest increase, men versus women. It's mostly men, except in women. For Texas, for women, it's Texas for some reason. They're up a lot. But anyway, so I have to get all this raw data, like thousands of lines of data by state, by year, by number, all this stuff. But none of that's actually in the article. What's in the article is just the state-by-state jump, which is all aggregated and summarized. But now I got to get a quote from a real dentist. Do you actually see this as happening? And so that's where it's a numbers-driven story, but I need to actually figure out if this is a real thing or it's an aberration. And so if I have a visual and I have some numbers and I have a quote, then it's a really full-featured story that hits you from all avenues. So it's not just 3 anecdotes as a trend. I don't need 3 anecdotes. I probably just need 1 anecdote because the rest of the numbers prove that it's not just a trend.
So see, I'm just thinking, like, how would we support a story like that? There's probably a hashtag or something that'll be trending with Instagram posts and videos of people getting their teeth knocked out. That would maybe complement that story really well.
And the data's helpful because then I can correlate it to other things. If I just get a summary, then I can't do anything with it. Or if I just got a map, then I don't see the numbers. But if I have the numbers, I can correlate it. Well, is it states with more Catholic people? Is it states with more Irish people? Is it states with a bigger prison population? It turns out none of these are correlated. But at least I can try to do the analysis with it because I have the numbers. Yeah. So that's what the raw data is useful for, and then to go figure out if the story is true. Yeah, wear a mouth guard on Tuesday.
Well, yeah, speaking of looking into the crystal ball, so from wearing mouth guards. So as a wrap-up, what is sort of the future? How do you see this evolving? And not so distant future, just how do you see data journalism evolving?
Yeah, I mean, it's just becoming more and more entrenched where I work, and I imagine in most places. You know, from you can see that story is fantastic, and how could you tell that story without data, right? You could just say, oh, here's a guy who got his teeth knocked out, but you couldn't ever prove that this is actually fundamentally related to this holiday. And now we can, so, you know, obviously that's an important thing to be able to do. Generally speaking, I mean, when we're at the point of the journal now where when we pitch high-profile stories, stories that are going to be on the front page, or at least aiming for the front page, you know, the question that usually comes back immediately, and this pisses a lot of people off, is, you know, well, what does the data say? And I can't speak to how it is in other organizations, but I expect that, you know, it's probably similar, because everyone who works in media has sort of gradually realized that you can really tell sweeping stories this way, in a way that you just can't from as much on-the-ground reporting as you want. You cannot capture an entire country in any, you know, you just can't. You have to have data to do that.
Eric?
And I would say, at least at CNBC, we're probably one step behind that. They won't necessarily say, what does the data say? They'll just figure out, oh, well, does that make for good television? Or does that make for a good Twitter headline? And so they're still stuck in their framework in a kind of traditional media approach. So you have to find cool stories, but use the data to tell those stories, because in the end, when we're pitching our things to our managers, they're old school newspaper and old school TV guys. So they're still expecting the same type of headlines and lead story, you know, the lead part of it. And, but they won't actually ask what the data says. They're just expecting me to tell them, here's what the data says, and then they figure out how to package it.
Yeah, from our perspective, it's just, I think it comes back to, and I think Rob was referring to this a little bit, it's where terms like data journalism or social-based social news, this is just terms that should go away. I mean, just part of journalism, period. I think that will slowly begin to happen more and more over the next 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there used to be, what we do used to be called computer-assisted reporting, right?
Yes.
And obviously, what reporting can you do today without using a computer? It's not necessary, you know.
Yeah, I think the silos will break down, because if you go back 10 years ago, for example, at a newspaper or a television channel, when they started adding the website to it, you'd have people that were just, quote, the web reporter. And so now everybody's a web reporter, right? You're not just doing one thing. So I think in the same way, eventually everyone will be expected to know how to do some basic analysis and programming and computer-assisted and data-driven reporting, that it'll just become a standard tool in the sense that, if you look even going way back, maybe one person used to have a BlackBerry, and that was the guy at the office who had a BlackBerry, and oh, he's the one who's on call. Now everyone is on call. So in that sense, I think it'll all just merge, and like he said, it's all just journalism, and it'll all just be what we do.
Terrific. Well, that is it for our panel. I know we could go on for a while here if you happen to have the time to catch up with folks afterwards. So please, let's give them a round of applause.